At some point in your life, if it hasn't happened already, someone's going to come up to you and ask, why is there suffering in the world if there's a God? If there is a God who could prevent suffering, then why does suffering still happen? Why is there evil in the world? Well, today we're going to discuss that, and I'm going to give you the answer, the best answer we have, and I think it's a pretty darn good one. If an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God, an omniscient God exists, then evil does not. So that means an all-powerful, all good, like no evil at all in the God, all good, and all-knowing God exists, then evil does not, because such a God would be able to prevent it. There is evil in the world, therefore an omnipotent, benevolent, and omniscient God does not exist. So what it's doing is it's setting up a logical contradiction. It's saying that an all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing God would stop evil, and yet evil exists, therefore that kind of God can't exist. Well, this was answered a few decades ago by Alvin. No, not that Alvin, this Alvin. Alvin Plantinga answered this in a short book, basically saying this: God has given us free will. Therefore, evil doesn't need to come from God, it can come from us. And God giving us free will is a greater good than us not having it. Basically, free will is a greater good than the suffering that we see. If God took away free will, it would be God doing something evil. Therefore, evil exists in the world because of our own free will. So we are the cause of evil. And God cannot impinge on that. God cannot take away our free will, or he would be doing a greater evil than the evil that we do. So that is the answer to that argument. And no self-respecting philosopher would continue to use that argument because of that. That doesn't mean you won't encounter that at some point. Usually you'll just encounter it by people saying, hey, like, why does evil exist? Why do I see suffering? And our response to that is, well, because of us. We are broken people. We choose to do evil. And we all know a scenario where what happens when we don't have free will. We've seen it in movies, and that's going to bring me on to this. So the next question is, well, but isn't there suffering that God could prevent without preventing free will? Basically, I have an example of this, and I've told you this story. My friend Dylan from the coffee shop where I used to work. He was driving late one night with his girlfriend, and he had a seizure and flew off the road and hit a tree and died. Now, that's not someone doing evil to him. That is suffering that happened as a result of a disease, a natural phenomenon. So could not have God prevented that without impinging on free will? That's the question. And here's the answer. Here's one of the answers. So we're actually moving into arguments that are more probabilistic. These are called the probabilistic problem of suffering. Meaning, if these things are true, then God probably doesn't exist. These things are probably true, therefore God doesn't exist. This is not a logical contradiction like the first one. This is more on the like, well, here are other problems with this idea of God that you have. So, is there suffering in the world that God could prevent without preventing free will? Well, the first thing I want to say is suffering produces character. We see that in the Bible too, is that there are positive effects of suffering. So there needs to be suffering in the world in order for us to grow. If all evil were just the result of direct actions of people, then we could just blame it all on evil people and not have to deal with the fact that suffering exists. Suffering exists in the world because of sin. We brought suffering into this world by our choice to sin. I believe that our sin has affected the world. So we see disease, we see suffering as a result of that. And yet, we need to encounter suffering in order to have character produced in us. Now, imagine with me movies about utopia. We've seen those in movies like The Island, and I honestly can't think of any other examples at the moment. But imagine with me this very sheltered community where they never have to experience suffering. They never have to experience anything negative. We've seen those kinds of movies, and we see the result of that. You end up with very immature, naive, childlike people because suffering helps us grow. So even though it really is, it's not fun experiencing suffering. As someone who has experienced suffering myself, I can tell you it's not fun experiencing suffering, and yet I am a better person as a result of the suffering that I've encountered. So that's one possible reason. But then the question then becomes, well, isn't there suffering that exists in the world that we don't see? What about suffering that humans never see? Could God prevent that? It wouldn't impinge on free will. It's not producing some kind of character in us because we're not experiencing it. Imagine a tree falling in the middle of the woods where no one has ever gone and will never go, and it lands on some woodland creatures like Bambi. And now Bambi's dead. We're never going to see that. So isn't that suffering that God could have prevented? And the answer is yes. But then how do we know that thing happened? The minute that we see an animal that's been killed in the forest, that's no longer an event that we didn't witness. We now have seen the after effects of this. There's simply no way of proving that suffering happens that we never see. The moment we see it, the moment we observe it, it is now suffering that we've seen. So there's just no way of proving that that kind of suffering exists. So maybe it does. We could say, well, it makes sense that it does, but we don't know that. We absolutely don't know that. So, and last of all, so you could still say, okay, I see what you're saying about free will. I see what you're saying about how suffering produces character and therefore we need suffering, but why is all of this necessary? Why don't we just skip all of this? Maybe it would be better to have a utopia. It doesn't seem worth it that we have all this suffering. And to that I give you this last response is that heaven, where we're going in the end when Jesus comes back, is greater than everything that we have experienced here. The goodness that comes from us experiencing heaven far outweighs the evil that happens as a result of suffering. It far outweighs all of the troubles that we go through here. And part of what we're going to experience in heaven is what we've experienced here. Our character is being formed and shaped by all of our experiences so that when we get to heaven, we don't live in some kind of naive dream world where we've never had to experience anything negative. We can enjoy the joys of heaven because of what we've experienced here. So that the suffering that we experience here actually enhances what we're going to get to experience in heaven. So I would say, yes, man, it's sometimes hard dealing with the fact that suffering exists and we have to deal with that. And yet as Christians, we look forward to a time when we don't have to experience that, when we get to experience a joy unlike anything we've seen. So our focus should be on bringing people into the kingdom, bringing people closer to God so that they can experience that too. Because the last thing we want to do is get hung up on all these questions and lose sight of the people who need God right now so that they can experience God for an eternity. So I'm not telling you to not ask these questions. If this still doesn't make sense to you, I encourage you to talk to me. More so, I encourage you to talk to God. I am not afraid of questions. I'm not afraid of asking God hard questions. But what I am afraid of is us throwing words at God without wanting a response from God. I remember a friend of mine who his brother had left the faith, had become an atheist. And that was really, really hard on my friend. It's really hard seeing a family member decide to leave Jesus behind and go pursue your own kingdom and not the kingdom of God. Because you have to wrestle with the fact that this person's not going to get to experience an eternity with God. And I was talking to my friend, and I feel like God gave me wisdom that time. I don't always feel like that, but I feel like this is from God. And I said to him, we should never be afraid of questions, but we should never talk at God. We should talk with God. We should never complain at God. we should complain to God. The difference being that we want God to respond. We go to God expecting and desiring a response. We draw closer to God through our suffering and through the doubt and questions that we have. We don't push God away. So I encourage you, if you're struggling with that, don't push God away. Instead, use this as an opportunity to draw close. Never be afraid of questions. Instead, use those questions as an opportunity to get to know God more.